Welcome to this episode of the Canada History Society's series on British Columbia Confederation. In this, the 17th episode of the Canada History's 20-part series, we look at the meeting of British Columbia and Canada. History, said Churchill, is written by victors, but it is made more often than not by men in railway compartments, dining cars, and dimly lit boardrooms. And in the summer of 1870, as the mists rolled off the inner harbor of Victoria, British Columbia prepared to send forth its emissaries, not in fanfare, but in trepidation. The colony was remote, fragile, and economically threadbare. Its position on the edge of empire, both its curse and its opportunity. It was, in the words of historian Margaret Ormsby, a place suspended between isolation and ambition. The three men chosen to represent the colony in the negotiations with the Dominion of Canada were themselves a portrait in contrast. Dr. John Sebastian Helmcken, son-in-law to Sir James Douglas, and a legislative veteran of the colony, was thoughtful, skeptical, and steeped in the cautious traditions of the Hudson's Bay Company. "I would rather we join nobody," he had once said. "We are too far from all else to matter." Joseph William Trutch, the Surveyor General and soon-to-be Lieutenant Governor, was a firm British imperialist and a shrewd administrator who viewed Confederation as the best defense against American expansionism. And Dr. Robert William Carrall, a physician and a Confederationist, had served in both colonial politics and military medicine, and brought with him a sense of urgency and practicality.
In May 1870, British Columbia sends a delegation to Ottawa to discuss with Sir John Macdonald and the Cabinet the concept of joining with the Dominion of Canada. Joseph Trutch is one of the members, Dr. Carrall is another, and John Helmcken is a third member. There was a newspaper reporter who went a day previous on his road trip to Ottawa to cover the story for the British colonists, the Victoria paper. And that makes for interesting reading. Now, this delegation was not quite sure whether they would be able to get what they wanted. They had their wish list, they had their long list, they had their expectation list. They were hoping for a railway as a distant possibility, but they at least wanted a road that would come across through the Continental Divide to provide a material transcontinental link. Their expedition was wonderful. It took them south to connect with American railways, to go right across over the Continental Divide, a charming trip by way of the Central Pacific Railway. And Helmcken was convinced, after having done this extraordinary tour through the Rocky Mountains, that this could possibly be done in British Columbia as well. It was travel that converted him to the pro-Confederation point of view, if ever he had any doubts about it.
On June 5th, 1870, the delegates departed Victoria aboard the Pacific Mail steamer bound for San Francisco. Their course was no coincidence. At this time, it was easier to reach Ottawa by steamer to California, followed by American rail across the continent, than to attempt the wilderness trek across Canada's vast interior. It was a route heavy with symbolism. The Union Pacific had completed its transcontinental line just a year earlier, a gleaming testament to the United States' unshakable manifest destiny. Even as they sailed south, wrote Donald Crichton, the delegates were traveling through the heart of the American imperial shadow. In San Francisco, they paused briefly, long enough to observe, if not admit, the subtle lure of annexation. Many on the Pacific coast frustrated by British neglect and distant Ottawa, quietly contemplated the United States as a more natural partner. American newspapers occasionally referred to British Columbia as a sister waiting to be claimed. Yet the delegates had no illusions. The Canadian offer, though uncertain, came with imperial legitimacy and the promise of partnership, not absorption. From San Francisco, they took the American Railway east, riding along the blistering Nevada desert, the booming towns of the Great Plains, and into the industrial heart of the eastern states. It was a journey of nearly 3 weeks, offering them time to reflect on what they sought and what they might concede. Helmcken, ever the realist, wrote privately, "If we can get terms that respect our local autonomy and promise real connection, I am ready. But I do not trust politicians who have never seen the Pacific."
Helmcken, I've come to realize, is a very quizzical figure. He could play both sides, and he was a populist in the sense that he gave people the impression that he could do it one way or another. But it was the railway which was the convincing factor. And as long been said, the national dream was a railroad dream. And in fact, this had been central to the whole idea of building the Dominion of Canada of 1867 with railway links to Halifax and through to Montreal, and then up to Toronto and through Ottawa. Now, the other two that are in the cavalcade of investigation, Carrall and Trutch, are already on side. Carrall comes from a small town in southern Ontario. He's a populist. He knows about responsible government. Trutch, the engineer and surveyor, is the powerful head, realizing that in the union with Canada, or the Confederation with Canada, lies the future. And these people go to Ottawa. Sir Johnny Macdonald is unavailable, is in ill health at this time, and they are entertained by Etienne Cartier, who's the number 2 in the cabinet. He's the head of the Quebec caucus. And after the initial meeting, there are several enlarged meetings, and the discussion goes on for days with the enlarged cabinet. The British Columbians are introduced to all the major players. They're treated royally. They are given every consideration, and they come back from this meeting with a wonderful belief that, yes, Canada as a confederation can work for British Columbia.
They arrived in Ottawa in late July, early August 1870, entering a political capital still under construction, physically and constitutionally. The young Dominion of Canada had only been established 3 years earlier in 1867, and its unity was more hope than certainty. Prince Edward Island and Newfoundland had refused to join. The Red River Rebellion under Louis Riel was still unfolding, and yet, for the Canadians, British Columbia's delegation brought the chance to fulfill a national dream. Waiting for them in Ottawa were Canada's most seasoned architects of confederation. At their head stood Prime Minister Sir John A. Macdonald, a man whose mind, historian Richard Gwynne once said, moved like smoke through cracks in woodwork. With him stood the indispensable Georges-Étienne Cartier, Macdonald's French-Canadian counterpart, a man who had dragged Quebec into Confederation and now turned his fierce intellect toward the Pacific. Alexander Galt, Canada's economic strategist, also stood ready to craft the terms. Their reception of the delegates was polite but urgent. They knew that annexationist sentiments were alive on the Pacific coast, and that delay might cost them the West. The opening talks were marked by cautious civility. The British Columbians, though impressed by Ottawa's courtesy, were unmoved by vague promises. They came with a list of firm demands: the construction of a transcontinental railway to begin within 2 years and be completed within 10, provincial control of Crown lands and resources, in line with Canadian provinces, but distinct from the old colonial system, the assumption of the colony's public debt, estimated at $1.6 million, a subsidy package including a $100,000 annual grant plus a per capita amount tied to population. To these, the Canadian side responded not with denial, but with bold counteroffers. Macdonald and Cartier understood the stakes. Canada needed the Pacific to solidify its claim to the North American continent. If we do not take the West, Cartier told Parliament, someone else will. His tone in private was sharper. The Americans have their rails. If we cannot match them with promise and steel, then we deserve to lose. Cartier played the role of cultural intermediary with skill. Fluent in both French and English, he spoke to Helmcken of constitutional guarantees, to Trutch of imperial loyalty, and to Carrall of national purpose. Cartier, said historian W. Stewart Wallace, could talk like a parrot in 3 languages and think like a general in silence. One of the most contentious issues was the railway. Helmcken was dubious. Could such a feat ever be accomplished? And who would bear the cost? Galt offered assurances grounded in national interest, promising that the railway would not be a mere project, but a national obligation, written into the Union terms. A clause would bind Canada by law to begin within 2 years and finish within 10. If not, British Columbia could, in theory, withdraw from Confederation. The Canadians sweetened the deal further. In addition to debt assumption and the railway clause, they offered full representation in the House of Commons and Senate, and protection for British Columbia's land laws and public works. Trutch, whose engineering background made him acutely aware of the train difficulties, was surprised by the depth of commitment. As the talks drew to a close in early September, Helmcken, though still wary, recognized the magnitude of what had been achieved. We have secured better terms than I expected, he admitted in a private letter, but time will tell if they are to be honored. He would later reflect that he had arrived to oppose Confederation, but left Ottawa convinced that British Columbia had no better choice. The agreement, summarized in 14 carefully worded articles, was ratified by the Dominion government and sent to London for final approval. It was, by all accounts, a triumph of negotiation over coercion. The union of British Columbia with the Dominion of Canada, wrote Crichton, was not an accident, but an act of conscious political imagination, midwifed by steel, sealed with statesmanship. For Cartier, the agreement was his final great act. He died less than a year later, having sacrificed his health and fortune to the cause of Confederation. But with British Columbia secured, Canada's arc, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, was finally drawn. Thus, what began as a voyage of doubt from the sleepy streets of Victoria ended in a triumph of diplomacy in the capital of a young Dominion. The delegates returned west with a signed promise and the beginnings of a nation in their hands. The railway would come, the mountains would be crossed, and British Columbia, once a distant fur trading outpost, would become a cornerstone of Canada, not by force, but by consent. Join us next time for Part 18 of the Canada History Society's 20-part series as we explore the terms of Confederation. What BC got, what Canada got.